All right. Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us. It's our pleasure today to be hosting Dr. Sierra Young, who will be talking to us about precision technologies for physical and visual sensing and agricultural systems. Dr. Young is an assistant professor and extension specialist in the Department of Biological and Agricultural Engineering at North Carolina State University. Her research focuses on the use of robotics and automation for sensing and sense-making in agricultural and natural systems, and human-robot interaction for small, unoccupied systems. She also conducts extension work in the area of sensors and robotics for precision management. Dr. Young was awarded the New Faces of ASABE top honoree and was recently invited to participate in the 2021 National Academy of Engineering U.S. Frontiers of Engineering, or FOE, Symposium. Before arriving at NC State, she worked as a visiting scholar in the Agricultural and Biosystems Engineering Department at Iowa State University, and Dr. Young received her PhD in civil engineering as a Department of Defense NDSEG fellow with a focus on the human-robot interaction for physical object manipulation by small aerial systems from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign in 2018. So we're very happy to have you here. I know that though you're outside of ECE, there's a lot of what you're going to talk about which is very relevant to ECE, so I think it'll be a very interesting talk for everyone. Take it away.
Thank you.
There you go.
All right. Okay, can everyone hear me? This is my first in-person seminar since pre-COVID, and I'm very excited. So thank you all for joining in person. Very excited to be here. So today I'm going to kind of talk about a variety of projects that kind of focus on applications in agricultural and biological engineering, but that focus on the use of robotics technologies and other sensing technologies. So first, just give an overview, kind of myself and my group, my research lab. So we are the Digital Agroecology and Intelligent Systems, or the DAISY lab. And what we do is we focus on the development of new sensing technologies and equipment for gathering data, largely out in the field. So think field robotics, field sensing, some greenhouse work as well, but mostly in the context of biological and agricultural systems. That is the focus of most of the research that we do, but with that, if you're out collecting data in some of these environments, we also want to be able to process that data, turn it into valuable information. So we have this focus on developing technologies, but we also want to make sure that what we're doing is ultimately going to result in useful information. And then the third piece is either integrating this information or working with folks that can help use this information in a decision support or action. So ultimately, if we're going to do something in the field, gather data, we want to take that data, make it useful, and ultimately tie that back into an action or a decision to kind of close that loop. So of the projects that we work on, really the sweet spot is to kind of be in the middle, but where a lot of the focus happens is on the development of new kind of autonomous systems and for a variety of specific applications. And so I kind of like to think of myself and all the folks in my group as representing this broken comb. And what I mean by this is that we work across a wide variety of applications, and depending on the problem that we're trying to solve, we draw from different areas of technical depth. So you'll see that in this presentation today. So depending on kind of what we're interested in, so I have a background in water resources, but after coming to NC State, have been heavily involved with precision agriculture, precision livestock farming, and also phenotyping as related to agriculture. And through that, the development of new robotic systems, and the emphasis may be on developing autonomy or computer vision for analyzing agronomic products, et cetera. So kind of depending on the application, the key is that we're motivated by the problem, and then we draw from these different technical areas to solve that problem. So my group is pretty diverse. We have data science folks, mechanical engineers, agricultural engineers. We kind of form this group where we can address this diverse set of problems. And this is useful because whenever we go out to monitor or collect data in these agricultural and biological systems, it's a challenging task. So this is a variety of systems that we've worked in. So row crops at the intersection of natural systems, row crops that might seem structured on the surface, but are actually very cluttered and semi-structured environments there in the middle. And then most recently, coastal systems. So these can be uncertain, dynamic, and unstructured or semi-structured. And so to autonomously collect meaningful information, we need to rely on a suite of tools. So one of the tools that I focus quite a bit on is the development of unoccupied systems. And this includes some experience with aerial, a focus on aerial, but also ground and surface vehicles. And these are really useful because they enable us to improve our throughput of data collection, but most importantly, accessibility. So if we're going to go out in more of a biological or natural system, using unoccupied systems is really valuable. And especially if we're doing repetitive tasks, repetitive monitoring in the context of agriculture, again, ground vehicles, UAVs are really important. And so using these unoccupied systems as science tools, we can kind of group the applications along this spectrum. So we can use unoccupied systems for initial exploration, where they give us that access, or maybe we don't necessarily know what our end goal is or what we're going to encounter, but we can use these platforms to conduct an exploration. Or we can conduct more routine monitoring. Ultimately, our goal is to kind of move along to understanding that environment, to make decisions, or to take an action. So this is kind of that spectrum, depending on the application and what you know about that environment. Generally, the operations kind of fall into any of these categories. And so I'm going to get into a couple of different projects, focusing on mostly UAVs, some ground vehicle work, some surface vehicle work, all in the context of agriculture and biological systems. So one of the important things in agriculture and plant breeding is what's known as phenotyping. And phenotyping is measuring many different traits. So phenotypic characterization, these are traits that we can see. So this is things like yield, disease resistance, stress adaptation, plant architecture, so size, shape, color, things like height, and also quality and quantity. And so in the context of plant breeding, being able to characterize these phenotypes for a single crop and characterize those phenotypes for many different genotypes or genetic lines, we can then start to identify the best performing, the highest yielding, the tallest, the plants with the highest biomass, and use that information in the context of breeding better crops, essentially. And also do some work in the context of environmental adaptation. So where my work fits in with this pipeline, collaborating a lot with plant breeders here at NC State, is doing phenotypic characterization in the field, which is quite challenging. So this happens, in controlled growth chambers, in greenhouses, and at the field scale. And the field scale, because there's so much variability, it's really the most challenging environment to do high throughput and accurate phenotyping. To do that, we're measuring these observable traits. We can use a variety of technologies. So we have a couple different sensors, such as hyperspectral imagers, multispectral imagers, depth sensors, stereo cameras to try to quantify things like spectral reflectance, size, and shape. We can collect this information from the air using UAVs, or if we really need high resolution information, from ground vehicles. And ultimately work with those data and collaborate very closely with plant breeders and folks who are living here in that genetic information space. So one important area where plant breeding happens is predicting biomass. And in the context of biomass, this here is sorghum. And if you've never seen or been in a field of sorghum, it gets extremely tall. This is late season. And sorghum is an important crop because it can be used for cellulose, obtaining cellulose materials and developing biofuels. So when we're phenotyping for these biomass crops, we want the plants or the genetic material with the highest amount of biomass per unit area. That generally means you want the tallest plant, the most dense plant, the thickest, and the most plant material. And so that's where we come in with our phenotyping. And so traditionally, or without the use of these technologies, this is how you would do high throughput phenotyping with a measuring stick, and you go out in every plot and you measure plant height, either individual plants or at the plot level. And it can be very time consuming. I personally don't enjoy sitting in a Miscanthus field in 95-degree heat in the middle of July, but if you like to, then maybe you can just not use automated technologies. But motivated by this problem, we were wondering, how can we design a ground-based platform for high-throughput phenotyping of plant architecture in the context of a plant developed for biomass and biofuels production? So the easiest thing might be, why not use UAVs? Well, in the context of plant architecture, these plants that have high biomass and are very dense, the canopy closes over very early in the growing season. So if you fly UAVs, your information is really only valuable up to a certain point, and for a majority of that growing season, you can't see below the canopy. You don't have a good idea of what's actually happening with respect to detailed plant architecture. So in the context of phenotyping things like height and stem width and individual leaf area for plants, we need to get below the canopy. And so this was our solution, a ground-based platform with a variety of sensors. You can see it here. This is very early season sorghum before it gets very tall. And we have a stereo camera mounted on the top of this mast structure to capture plant height, an infrared time of flight sensor at the base to capture stem width, and then a GoPro kind of 3D hemispherical camera pointed upward, and that captures the leaf area index, or how much of that view is essentially leaf material versus sky material, or sky. And so to do this, we are capturing information for individual plants, right? We need to tie back these phenotypes to a specific genotype, to a plot in the field. So to do that, we have to have really high precision in our control so we know exactly where all this information was collected. So we built this robot essentially from scratch, which was fun, but I don't advise you always doing that. And to do that, we developed our own controller running on an onboard computer. And the primary position feedback was from a RTK GNSS receiver. And then we had to kind of implement a variety of filters. And one thing that was really interesting, I don't know if you saw that mast, but as the plants grow throughout the season, they get from about a meter tall to a couple meters tall. That mast structure that has our receiver must always be above the plant canopy. So this plant canopy is extremely dense. You don't always get a great signal from that receiver if it's below that dense canopy. So we always had to continually adjust that canopy height to the plant growth stage. Interestingly, agricultural fields, even in Illinois where this work was done, are really not flat, contrary to what you might think. So even small perturbations in the soil, you have that tracked robot and you have maybe a couple inches here or there. Well, that displacement in your mast is severely then exaggerated. So having compensation to adjust for that position feedback in the receiver, depending on the orientation of the ground robot and the height of that mast, was kind of an interesting problem that we sort of learned on the fly. When you kind of think you know the environment, this is my first true agricultural robotics project. You conceptualize agricultural fields as being pretty homogeneous and flat, with clean rows, and that really is not the case, and it can lead to some interesting complications in a control framework and an autonomy. But we ultimately were able to compensate for that and get pretty good position accuracy, a couple centimeters. You can kind of see here that difference between early field season and late field season. And this is, well over 12 feet at this point. So this was a pretty challenging kind of adaptation that we had to make in this platform to be able to use it for the entire growing season. And another important thing was that we send this robot kind of headless into the field, but how do we know we're capturing quality phenotypic information? So we had to, we had to set up a data visualization system so we know we're capturing the right phenotype essentially. And so we kind of set up a remote desktop, kind of this field deployment package, a local network, so we could actually view the data in real time during the development of this platform, which was really, really useful. And so these are just some samples of the data and the results that we obtained from the system. The full manuscript was published in Precision Agriculture. But we can see here that using time-of-flight sensing, we can detect individual stems and ultimately get a measurement for stem width. You can see here this hemispherical imaging. You can calculate a percent that is covered by leaf material versus sky. And here, these are the results from our stereo imaging where we can track kind of the top contour of the canopy. And so we can get a contour of plant height at the individual plot level. Again, some quirks about working in agriculture or sorghum specifically. Sorghum stems, when we're measuring stem width, they are not circular, they are elliptical. So if you are measuring stem width here, depending on where that camera is, you might get a different measurement as the stem passes through your field of view. So we ultimately had to implement stem tracking, averaging those width measurements, because the one-time measurement for an elliptical stem doesn't do you much good, because when you ground truth that measurement, you may be off a little bit. So it's always interesting to learn these things as you go and not being able to foresee all these details. So recently, after coming to NC State in the last year, we've been doing something with a similar objective, but using a different technology. So here at NC State, at the Williamsdale Biofuel Research Center, they have plots of Miscanthus. And Miscanthus is similar to sorghum in that it is a crop that has really high biomass used for biofuels production. It gets about the same height, but unlike sorghum, which is a row crop and annual, you plant it every year, this is a perennial. So you establish this grass, and then you don't have to replant every year. You harvest it, and the rhizome, the root structure, stays in the ground, and that regrows every year. And so you can see it does not have rows like sorghum does. It's essentially just dense vegetation. It's very, very difficult to even walk through there. So there's no way you're going to ground robot through a plot of Miscanthus. That was off the table from the get-go. But we are still interested in, can we phenotype Miscanthus and ultimately predict biomass, but using UAVs. So I noted there are limitations earlier, but since we really just could not use any different type of platform, can we do so with UAVs, and what data are necessary? So you can capture physical information, spectral information, all from a single UAV sensor. So this is an aerial shot of the field site at the Williamsdale Biofuels Field Laboratory. And we use for data collection the MicaSense Altum camera, which is shown here, and it's a 5-band multispectral sensor. You can see there the RGB red edge and near infrared, and it also has a thermal sensor, which we didn't really use for this project, but it can come in handy. And so with this sensor, you can capture RGB information, use that for structure for motion techniques to develop 3D models of the site. You can also use the spectral information to capture plant response and calculate vegetation indices. So first, when you think about plant biomass, things like height and stem width, plant architecture are the biggest, predictors of biomass. So we first want to say, can we capture accurately plant height for a plot using a UAV and structure for motion techniques? So we went out to the field and we did manual measurements of canopy height, and we also evaluated structure from motion canopy height from UAV. And interestingly, also, if you've seen the picture with the measuring stick, it's not super clear where the height of the canopy is. So there's error in that measurement as well, but it's really the best that we can do. So just take that manual ground truth with a little bit of grain of salt. But you can see here that, the results are good, not great. But we did collect data very, very late season one year. And Miscanthus, at the end of the growing season, will start to senesce. And this is where the crop starts to die. It gets a little wilty, it turns brown, and it starts to sort of fall over. And so plant height is no longer necessarily a really great indicator of biomass at that point. So if we eliminate that data set, which was a little bit into senescence, we can see here that we have a much better agreement between our manual measurement and our structure for motion, although I do have a little bit consistent underestimation, but it is consistent across the data set. So we can reasonably get estimates of canopy height at the plot level from a UAV. And with this information, you start to see some interesting things throughout the growing season. So we collected data about every couple weeks from late May to August. And part of this was an exploration into what information is necessary, what's valuable. So you can see here, there's a rapid kind of growth between canopy height in early June and just 2 weeks later, mid-June. We actually missed a lot of those growth dynamics. So we kind of learned here that early season data collection is much more important than sort of your mid to late season to kind of capture what this growth rate is early on. And when we break these data down at the individual plot level, so there are two different varieties, Freedom and Illinois, which is basically two different genetic material of Miscanthus. We can again see that there's some interesting differences early on in the growing season, but really by the end of the season, there is no difference in biomass. So starting to tease out some interesting things about growth rate, differences between genetic material for in-field performance. We also wanted to see how valuable vegetation indices were. And so if you're not familiar with vegetation indices or VIs, they are indicators that you can calculate essentially using band arithmetic with the images that give you an indicator about how either stressed or healthy or kind of what is going on in that image. The most commonly used is Ndvi, Normalized Difference Vegetation Index, and this is the normalized difference between the reflectance in the near infrared region and the red region. And this gives you an indicator of vegetation vigor, basically. And this is because plant material has a very, very high reflectance in the near infrared and a very high absorption in the red. So you can see here that early on in the growing season, this is Ndvi in canopy height. So this conceptually is when the plants were shorter through the end of the season when they were taller, 3 meters. And Ndvi, because it is an indicator of vegetation kind of vigor and growth, sort of saturates very early in the growing season because these canopies are so dense and so thick. So kind of the most widely used vegetation index is really not very useful in the context of this particular crop. There's another index which is very similar, but instead of using the red, it uses the red edge reflectance, the normalized difference red edge index. We can see here that it definitely does not saturate out as fast. We can even pick up some late season, kind of as the plants grow tall, and then as they get too tall, they'll eventually senesce again, so we can start to see some differences. So the NDRE index was a little bit more useful in picking up differences between growth stages. And so using these data, we had gone out there and conducted manual harvests at a section of subplots. So we did actually kind of hack through the Miscanthus and harvested to get ground truth estimates of biomass for a subset of plots. And we developed kind of a preliminary model to estimate fresh biomass of Miscanthus using canopy height and a couple indices. And we're evaluating these models, but it looks like we're going to get some pretty decent results using some off-the-shelf UAV sensors, even though we can really only aggregate data at the individual plot level, not necessarily the individual plant level as we did with sorghum, but it still proved to be pretty useful. Again, this is kind of our model estimate. You can see here, these are different varieties, every other plot. Then we have subsections. You can kind of see some in-field variability when it comes to biomass. So we're going to just do kind of a hard transition into another project. Still focusing on using UAVs in the context of photogrammetry and now coupling that information with information obtained from surface vehicles. And now still focusing on agriculture, but leaning a little bit more into my civil and environmental engineering background in the context of hydrology and answering important questions about that interface between surface water and groundwater hydrology and water used for agriculture. I'll stop here if you have any questions because I'm chunking this into projects. So if you have questions about the first set of projects, I can take those now or you can wait till the end. Yeah.
Yeah, so when you're doing the image collection, you talk about a data visualization tool. Are you using any kind of like classification algorithms, like you're labeling images and then letting it compute it, or is it just based on you have some other way of computing the features, like the phenotype that you want to see?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the physical measurements were all done using, I would say, more classical computer vision techniques, not necessarily machine or deep learning, just by nature of the sensors and the information we were using. But that's definitely, so for other phenotypes, like if you're phenotyping fruit or other things in field, you need to detect the object and then measure like its color or shape or things like that. That's definitely an approach that I've seen taken. Yes.
In your plots, when you have Ndvi, this is height, canopy height. Is each dot a texture that you have taken for a plant, or what is the texture?
Yeah, that's a good question. So that is a small kind of plot unit area. So we couldn't really tease out individual plants for Miscanthus because the canopy is so dense. So we kind of normalize per a plot, which is, yeah, a unit area for that field.
So, can you go back to these 5 slides when you show the data collection system for images? Before that one, for the, I think it was Sorghum, the one before, the one before.
5 slides, 15 slides.
Yeah, no.
Okay, sure.
Yeah,
That's not a problem.
so I remember you guys developed a control mechanism for the robot itself, but I was wondering here, so you guys were tracking, I think the height of the plant as one of the indicators, right? Also reflectance, were you guys taking care of the reflectance?
Not for this project. This project was focused primarily on architecture, so height and the leaf area index and the stem width.
Right, so to estimate the height, were you guys pretty much just looking at like kind of a line between the plants and the sky in order to estimate the, okay. Did you guys have any problem to track individual plants? Did you guys have to deal with that?
Yeah, so that's a really great question. So for the height measurements, we did do those at the plot level. So the plots, I don't know if you've ever seen a breeding trial, but they're small plots and they're separated by a row, a break between genotypes. And so you're exactly right, when you have that sensor mounted at the top, you don't necessarily, this dense canopy, you can't track that, leaf basically down to a stem or a single plant. So we tracked that contour for that genotype over the single plot, and then you get kind of like an average. But then the width measurements were for individual plants.
Okay, and I think there's some trade-offs between how many widths you guys can catch and you can't, because you don't necessarily do you?
I mean, ideally, more information in the context of breeding is better. So, I mean, the plants have a pretty even spacing, so we could capture, it's not like Miscanthus, you can clearly see there's like, it's similar to corn, where they're planted on center at sort of an even spacing, so the planter operates according to your plan, so it's a little easier to actually detect each individual stem with this platform, but yeah, definitely not always necessary or possible. Whereas in Miscanthus, it's completely impossible to go in there and measure every single stem width for the plants or the stalks. So.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yep. Thanks. All right. Go through these. Okay. So this next project, it's really focused around a case study. So remember at the beginning, we're motivated by the problem. This case study was a project we worked on with close collaboration with researchers in India. And there's a catchment in South India that has been severely drying over the last decade. And it's particularly exacerbated because it's located adjacent to Bangalore, which is a major metropolitan area that has very high water withdrawals. And the problem was there are many different hypothesized reasons that are driving the drying in this basin. So some of those reasons were changes in precipitation and evapotranspiration, so really environmental drivers. And then these three over here are human drivers. So the fragmentation of the watershed by people installing dams in the waterways, increased groundwater extraction due to an increased number of wells, and increased water use due to land changes, and specifically an increase in eucalyptus, more water-intensive crop production. So in looking at these reasons, it turns out that there has been really no difference, and so we're left with kind of trying to tease out and understand these human drivers of potential causes of drying in this basin. This is really challenging because changes in land use are spatially heterogeneous across also through time. And then there's flow records in the basin, but they're insufficient for understanding how those changes have changed throughout space and time. So researchers have looked kind of closely at these different hypotheses, and one of the kind of leading hypotheses was the construction of those dams, or kind of human conveyance structures within the watershed. And there's these structures known as tanks, which are man-made kind of reservoirs that store surface runoff. So they're surface storage structures. And they look like this, where they have a storage area and a spread area and kind of this spillover. And then this might be agricultural land, where these are used for kind of manual irrigation. And so looking at this as one of those potential drivers, we can look at these tanks in this basin and use them to understand how the drying has changed through space and time. And we can do this because these tanks are plentiful, so they're spread out. There's hundreds of these throughout that basin, so that captures our space component. And we can actually see these in remote sensing records. So many of these are large enough to be, when they're kind of filled with water, you can see their surface area in historical satellite data, and that gives you that time component. So we can go back and get a sense of how much water was in these structures throughout the basin and then throughout time. But there's one key kind of piece missing, is that if you look at a 2D remote sensing satellite record of these structures, you don't necessarily know the relationship between the surface area and the volume or the storage capacity of these reservoirs. So this kind of component, which is part of a much larger study, but we were interested in, can we use aerial and surface platforms to capture that missing piece of hydrologic information so we can better understand drying trends through space and time. So we set out on a mapping and monitoring campaign in this region, and we were there at kind of an interesting time where there's monsoon seasons, and so a lot of these tanks were either, mostly dry if they haven't filled yet, or in the case of this one, partially wetted. So you can see there are dry areas of the tank and also wet areas of the tank. Sorry, I have to keep going over there. This laser pointer is broken. And so this required the use of UAVs to capture topography using photogrammetry over the dry areas of the tank. And we also used a surface vehicle equipped with a sonar to capture bathymetry in the wetted regions of the tank. So if we have both of those information, we can get a complete characterization of the surface. So processing these data kind of using standard photogrammetric software and also gathering kind of GPS coordinates of bathymetry. We can ultimately do data fusion and GIS software and get a complete surface reconstruction for each of these tanks. And just a side note, this work can be done manually. You can go do manual surveys, but it is quite labor intensive, especially with the sheer number of tanks in this area. So this was a very rapid method to characterize these structures. And we can gather then this kind of, a picture of how these structures kind of fill depending on the water level. So you can kind of see here, this might be what you see from satellite imagery. You have the surface area, and we can ultimately relate that to a stage, so a water level, and a storage volume. So if you have that kind of 3D representation, we know then the relationship between surface area and storage volume. And you can also capture the stage, which is another term for water level or depth. And so if we have this historical time series of depth, so if you're familiar with kind of USGS instrumentation or stream gauges, a lot of these tanks had those types of sensors installed. So you can kind of look at that historical record and get a sense for the water level throughout kind of a year period. We convert those to tank inflows. So we have our volume or our storage. And then we can ultimately get to inflows. So what we're looking at is to get an assessment of the hydrologic connectivity between these tanks. So we want to know how much water is actually flowing into these structures and being held during periods of rainfall. And just to put this in context of this study, so there are all those different hypothesized reasons for drying. Surface water storage is only one small part of the hydrologic process, right? There's groundwater infiltration, evapotranspiration, there's things with well, water depth, all these other things that come into play as far as water use and availability. So with our study, providing an estimate of how much water is in these structures and having that relationship, those 3D relationships for a small number, about 5 tanks, but those relationships were all relatively similar, so you can extrapolate that across multiple tanks. We were only in kind of that top row, middle point, so that was our tank inflow data piece. So all this information is ultimately tied together with all this other hydrologic data. And this is, a large study, not the focus of today's talk, but just to let you know that it turns out that groundwater depletion was the likely driver of stream flow. So kind of filling in this key missing piece using robot-assisted data helped answer a very important and complex hydrologic question in an area where, water use and water availability is very severe, similar to what's happening now with the Western U.S. So up until now, we've talked about using UAVs and other technologies, but mostly for remote sensing. So for doing photogrammetry, physical measurements, or spectral imaging, remote sensing, that's kind of the context in which most of us know and think about using UAVs. Until really this last decade, that was what we used them for. But advances in controls and stability, we can now have UAVs that physically interact with the remote environment. And this is really exciting. Some of these, I probably need to update some of these photos because a lot of this work was initially conducted in motion capture rooms, and more recently, we're seeing some of these manipulating UAV platforms be successful in real-world environments. So this is an area that I think is underexplored in the context of biological and agricultural systems, and something that we're working on now in my group. So before using them in kind of the context of agricultural sensing and sampling, we kind of need to think about the human-robot interaction or using these platforms. So when you add that layer of manipulation, it really makes the system more complex. And depending on the level of autonomy, the humans may have many different roles. So we can think of kind of these remotely piloted systems as both the unpiloted vehicle, in this case our manipulating UAV, and the operators or system monitors, depending on their role. And so it is more than just kind of a display, although that's very important. It's also about the autonomy, the system level design, and other choices that make a manipulating UAV system usable. And so in seeing kind of this suite of studies related to aerial manipulation, human-robot interaction had not really been fully explored. So a lot of those platforms may have been fully autonomous in kind of a motion capture room. But we said, okay, what happens when you take this platform and you put it in a real-world, cluttered, unstructured environment that may not be able to complete tasks fully autonomous? You may need to have some human input at some point into that operation, into the control. How do you do that? You know, telemanipulation is a widely studied field, but less so for aerial platforms. So we can think of classic telemanipulation. You might have a stationary control station, whether it's kind of the classic leader-follower setup, or it's a remote control, or you have many displays. Doing things with the UAV in the field, where you have a mobile system, lightweight tablets, shorter missions. It really puts a different context in a telemanipulation mission. So the main question that we had is, what is the most effective telemanipulation interface for a small UAV where really there's an operator in control of the manipulation task? And so using established models for human-robot teaming for field robotics, we conducted a study kind of assigning roles based on what's known as the shared roles model. So for this, we have two primary roles. One is the pilot. So this, for the sake of our experiments, was a person, because safety and IRB, but this could also be a software agent. So this is the role that's responsible for airworthiness, navigation on the UAV. We also have the mission specialist that is responsible for operating the payload. In this case, the manipulator. And this is the kind of control that we're interested in evaluating. So one primary kind of constraint when you have a UAV is, where do you visualize the remote environment? You're really limited in terms of camera placement, field of view. So we really came up with these two kind of views. One was an exocentric point of view, and this was a camera mounted on the back leg of the UAV. And it's exocentric in the sense that it's a third-person view of the manipulator in the space below the platform. We also have this egocentric, or sometimes known as an eye and hand camera, at the base of the manipulator, and this kind of gives a close-up view of that manipulation space. And so we wanted to see which view is better for performing different tasks. So we had people come in and perform a variety of tasks using the egocentric view, exocentric, or kind of a combination of both. And so this was a human-robot interaction, human-subject trial. We brought in 36 participants to actually complete these tasks. And we collected a wide variety of measurements, task performance time, psychophysiological measurements using a watch, questionnaires, kind of the whole 9 yards. And what was really important was that we were doing a repeatable experiment with 36 subjects, so we needed that robot to perform the same every single experiment. So again, precision and accuracy in the control system really came into play. So we did use a Vicon motion capture system. I guess I'm talking loud enough. And for the onboard controller, oh wow, how long has that been off my shirt? And that gave us really precise feedback, and so we were able to achieve really kind of centimeter level positioning with the UAV between participants. And so this was kind of all autonomous and managed by the experiment personnel and not a variable in the experiment. For the participants that came in, they used this mobile lightweight tablet interface. And they had full control over the manipulator, and they were also given a predetermined set of video streams from the onboard camera. So they truly are the mission specialists in that they only had control over the payload, assuming that the autonomy and navigation were all controlled by the pilot. So the tasks were a little bit generic. We had a probing task, a grasping task where they had to grasp that hoop, and also a pushing task where they had to rotate this plate. So a little bit variable in their complexity, but all participants completed 3 flights, each with the views, and then they completed each task every single flight. And so for context, we were trying to replicate as best as we could a true kind of field experiment where you would not have direct line of sight to the platform and the manipulation space. So we had the pilot kind of looking at the arena with a view of the UAV, and then we have the 2 views on the UAV. And the participants were seated facing away from the arena, so they could actually not directly see the UAV platform. Everything was viewed remotely through this interface. And this is just an example of kind of what it looked like. So we did have communication between the mission specialist and the pilot. Essentially, the mission specialist would give some high-level commands to place the UAV at where they wanted it to go by giving directional commands to move kind of precise directions and displacement. And then they had full control and tried to complete the manipulation tasks. And so what we saw was a little bit interesting. So there was no difference in the total task completion time between all of these views. So when you add up all the time to complete all 3 tasks, we hypothesized that more information would be better, but that really wasn't necessarily the case. But when you look at the success rate, so we gave them a time limit just due to time constraints, and the UAV can't fly forever, so you had 2 minutes to complete each task. And the success rate drastically dropped for that egocentric only view. And so there's kind of a lot on this slide, but one thing that we found was really interesting. We polled all the participants and asked them, which view did you prefer after they completed the entire experiment? And it turns out that if you kind of pull apart the data based on preference, for participants who preferred having mixed views, so having all information, there was no difference in their performance between having both views and the exocentric only. But for participants who preferred to only have the exocentric view, they performed tasks 50% faster using their preferred interface. So this led us to think that even though people think they might want more information, it doesn't actually lead to better performance. But if people prefer to have less information and they have information overload, that actually negatively impacted their task performance. And something that we also did kind of on the side was eye tracking. So we had a camera and we looked at which view they were side by side. So we tracked what they were looking at during the experiments and for how long. And so we got a sense of when people used each view. And as just some kind of performance indicators, we looked at, did people switch views longer or more using one interface? Did people spend more time using one view over the other? And it turns out there really was no difference. So we thought that perhaps for people who preferred to have one view, they switched back and forth just as much and spent the same amount of time on each view as people who preferred having both. So this was evidence that maybe perhaps their attention was allocated away towards that view they didn't necessarily want. So again, additional evidence that more information is not necessarily always better. And we had a lot of other data, but basically what we came down to is that, and also looking at survey results, having one exocentric view across the board was better, even though a majority of people preferred to have both views. And what we also learned from this is what view people use to complete what tasks. So it turns out people were looking at the egocentric view more for doing left and right and small adjustments, but the exocentric view provided valuable information for positioning the UAV and actually doing the manipulation. So now we're looking to use that information to go more from a static or a little bit dynamic interface to more of an adaptive interface where now we know what information is valuable in the context of different tasks. So can we pick out that salient information in the context of a task and display that to the operator? And so we kind of went down this little rabbit hole of human-robot interaction, and you're probably all thinking, what does this have to do with bio and ag engineering? Well, after conducting those kind of more fundamental laboratory studies, right now we're building UAVs that we hope to be able to manipulate and perform tasks in a real-world environment. So I'm going to end in the last few minutes talking about kind of our towards manipulation in real world in the context of loblolly pine. So whether you know it or not, you've lived in North Carolina more than a couple months, you've seen all the wonderful yellow pollen in the spring. That is largely due to loblolly pine. They're everywhere. But they're also, in addition to just being naturally occurring, are established on many, many acres throughout the entire Southeast, and they're used for timber production. And so there's this whole research group here at NC State, the Tree Improvement Program, that is dedicated to the genetic improvement and breeding of this specific tree species. And so this is what it looks like kind of in a seed orchard. And this is that wonderful yellow stuff we all love, and kind of a close-up of the cones and the pollen. And so they focus on improving the straightness and the thickness of the trunk, which is primarily what's harvested for timber, improving disease resistance, improving cold tolerance, all these genetic traits we talked about earlier, phenotypes. They do that in the Tree Improvement Program. As part of that, a part of the plant breeding process, they have to do what's known as a controlled cross. So, for reproduction in plants, you have to have pollen, and that will ultimately pollinate flowers. And so if you want to control the crosses and the pollination between plants, when the flowers are receptive to pollen, you actually have to enclose them off from ambient pollen so you know exactly what pollen is going to kind of pollinate those flowers if you want to control the genetic material. So they do this at a very, very large scale in seed orchards. This is located in Goldsboro, North Carolina. And they go out there in bucket trucks and pollinate every single bag, put the bags on, pollinate every single bag by hand multiple times to ensure that the pollen was received, and then go back up and take the bags off. This is an extremely, as you can imagine, labor-intensive process that happens every single year. And they do this with kind of a pneumatic pollen gun, which is kind of cool. But they go up there and they just stab all these bags, inject a bunch of pollen, and it's pretty impressive to watch. So this is an example of kind of a research context where they have that window on the bag so you can see what's happening, but this is what it looks like when that happens. And so we are wondering, can you use a UAV to perform that controlled pollination in an orchard setting? So you saw that video in an orchard, the trees are spread a little bit farther apart to let them grow. And all the bags are placed actually near the top of the canopy and towards the outside of the canopy. So we thought it was a pretty decent setup to explore the use of UAVs for controlled pollination. And this is ongoing work, but we've recently made some pretty neat progress. So one of my PhD students is working on this, developing a perception platform, and also separately now in kind of a lab setting, but an automated pollen injection system that's lightweight enough to be able to be mounted on a UAV. I'm ultimately moving towards automating that controlled pollination process. And so this is an example of where we're at now. So step one, we're kind of looking at, can we identify these bags and direct the UAV kind of in a position where it can pollinate. And to do that, we're using kind of a combination of RGB imagery and object detection models, as well as depth sensing for the actual trajectory control of the UAV to the bag. And then we have some really neat data using point feature histograms, where we can pretty readily detect the flat surface of the bag compared to the rest of the bag, so we can look at which surface is best for pollination. So kind of the bags have a wire in them, so that green surface is kind of flat and most ideal to be able, oh, that's beautiful. To be able to, this is grabbed from a video, to be able to detect that bag surface. And so we also have kind of recently had a success with the development of this prototype, where we have this delta kind of manipulator configuration where it can orient itself. And we started with this for orientation, and we recently coupled it with what we call as the claw. So it's a little bio-inspired by a beetle, but also, I don't know if anyone's played whirly ball. I'm from the Midwest, so I don't know if anyone even knows what that is. But it kind of reminded me of like the whirly ball claws. But we have this kind of one side of it which stabilizes the bag, and the other side has that needle with the pollen injector, and it kind of closes and injects the bag with pollen. And so then this is like the orientation mechanism that we use to orient the claw. And so we recently had some success working on improving that success rate in a lab setting, and are gradually going towards more mobile kind of controlled pollinations, and hopefully by the end of this project have a proof of concept controlled pollination done in an outdoor environment with the UAV. So going towards the ultimate goal of automating that controlled pollination process. So with that was the last project. It looks like there's time for questions. And just kind of an overview of what we do in our kind of broken comb setup, and using UAVs for a variety of applications, all the way from initial exploration to taking action with manipulating UAVs. So with that, I'll take any questions. Thank you for your attention. Yeah, so right now it's all 3D printed. That may change, but we're constantly iterating on the design. So that material there is all of that is 3D printed.
Yeah, I just wondering in terms of like extra weight to the UAV and battery life, like how much time do you guys get? You know, how much time can it be in the air to actually go around the pollen?
Yes, and that is a very good question. And we've kind of envisioned a system where you likely would have a tethered platform, because the pollen is also, I think they use nitrogen to inject it. It's not oxygen, so they have a compressed tank because it helps with like the pollen not clumping together. So we kind of envision that you might have your reservoir of compressed nitrogen tanks and a power bank, and you would have a tether up to the UAV, maybe multiple UAVs, and you could kind of move that around. So still within the constraints of the payload, but envisioning more of a tethered kind of system for that.
versus stuff that you have to develop entirely on your own. So, like, you just buy like an off-the-shelf drone and then add stuff to it, or you have to really build it from scratch? How does that process work?
Yeah, so that's a good question. You've mostly relied on commercially available parts for like the frame and the motors and the propulsion system, just because that stuff is pretty, it's pretty easy to find a nice frame, set of motors, some props, all that. When we get into, if we're doing like remote sensing, then all of that is off the shelf. But if we do kind of these more manipulation or specialized platforms, then we would take that frame, add our own computing, own controller, own sensors, actuation, and all of that as well. So one thing I didn't mention was for, that manipulating UAV, we had to modify the onboard controller to be able to withstand kind of the disturbances from that arm. So off-the-shelf base and then kind of Frankenstein, everything on top, yeah.
And how about like microwave or millimeter wave technologies for sensing? A lot of what I saw you present was optical sensors and so on, but there's a lot of stuff out there like radar and things like that that could probably also be used to reconstruct an image or take a measurement. Are those relevant? Is there like a frequency or wavelength compatibility issue? Why not try to do some of those?
That's a really good question. I am not as familiar with those sensing. The most complex thing we've used is like LiDAR, but I do know there are some groups that use that technology. From what I've seen, I don't know how accurate this is now, those payloads are pretty large and can be power intensive, so I think those platforms tend to be a little bit bigger. But for some of what we do with remote sensing, I'm not fully sure in the context of agriculture. I'm sure there's a lot of valuable information. I just don't know. I'm not as familiar with those types of technologies.
And I have one more question if I could.
Sure.
Like especially this latter half of your presentation, where you're talking about the human interaction component. It was interesting that you were both looking at the performance and the abilities of the drone, but also sort of the people side of it, right? Are they doing caring for all this? So is there an opportunity there to add sensors, more sensors for monitoring the people? Like, I was thinking that we have a lot of stuff that goes on in our department for chemical sensing of like sweat and stuff like that. But you maybe get a little bit more information about how stressed they are, or I don't know, other things that might tell them about their performance.
Yeah, that's interesting. We did attempt to do some basic like heart rate and electrodermal kind of activity with a basic watch, so nothing too fancy, kind of an off-the-shelf thing. Those data were a little noisy, and I know it can be kind of complex to do that, but I do think it would be interesting because we did see evidence of habituation, so they're a little more nervous, higher heart rates at the first, and then less so as the trial went on. So I definitely think there's for sure opportunities to kind of loop that back in and maybe even tie it in with the like the system controller autonomy or something like that, kind of thinking the driver-assisted technology, or if you're drifting off, it kind of alerts you or something like that, kind of bringing in those human, those sensors and feedback, maybe even into the system for sure. So yeah, that's an interesting idea. Yeah.
I was kind of wondering when you were comparing the different camera angles for people working with the UAVs, if you only ran it for like a few times. So I was thinking if it was possible that it was like a learning curve thing, like maybe there's the case that from one of the angles it was harder to learn it quite as quickly, but then once you got it after like a week of doing it, it might have been easier to use from that point forward. I was wondering if there was more of like you were looking into more of a longitudinal study in that sense.
Yeah, no, that would be interesting because we did counterbalance the conditions, so at least there were no learning effects like within subjects. But so doing a more longitudinal study would definitely give you some useful information in the context of how people can learn to use these platforms for sure. Yeah, no, that's a good idea. Thanks. Yeah.
So I'm interested in your comb analogy, where you have lots of different areas with various requiring technical depth. I'm wondering, how do you deal with it when you have a problem you want to solve that requires a technical depth in an area that you don't have? Because you obviously have lots of complex problems. Just how do you approach that?
Yeah, great question. Find someone who has it. So something that I probably should do a better job of is none of these studies kind of happened, in a vacuum with one or two people. They're all interdisciplinary collaborations. So really drawing in, because even, the experience that I have is limited. So finding collaborators and spending time to be able to, have a common language and learn about the problem. I know way more now about forestry and tree breeding than I ever thought I would know after spending so much time with the tree improvement program. So finding collaborators that have that expertise and then spending a lot of time working with them to learn their domain, be able to kind of understand where they're coming from has been really, really valuable working in these interdisciplinary projects. Yes?
I have two more questions if I have time.
Yeah, I think so. This one's at 30, right? So there's, okay, yeah.
Thanks. So regarding this project here, it's very interesting work. So I'm wondering here, for the case that you have the robot attaching the back to the pine, so the pine might be moving, so you have a force actuating the robot. Is there any solution out there that deals with this type of very hostile disturbance in the robot?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So we have been doing this in a lab setting with kind of limited flexibility of a branch, like a wire with, some flexibility, not fully rigid, but maybe less than what you'd see in the field. And so right now we're treating that as kind of just an external disturbance. So we're mostly focused on having a fast responding controller on board. And the pollination process is fast. If you can imagine it, it punctures and that's it. So we're kind of getting to that stage, but what we envision, what we've seen also with some of the other manipulation work is if you have kind of a fast action where the disturbance isn't too large, and that's why you also have this claw mechanism where it does pretty well stabilize by kind of holding on to the bag a little bit and being able to have something that compensates against that puncturing force as well. That is kind of our approach right now. But I'm definitely sure there's opportunities to, again, collaborate with folks who are kind of more in depth as far as real-time control and compensating for fast, potentially large forces like that.
Great. And the second is regarding the more of the first project you presented. So I saw a lot of visual based approaches, and I'm wondering if you had any experience, and you could share experience also with local sensing in the crop, for example, soil mixture or impedance in the crops, and if you kind of fuse that with the visual information, and what kind of experiences you have?
Yeah, that's a great point. So as far as my experience in modeling and integrating the phenotypic data with environmental data, I don't have much experience with that. That's mostly where we kind of collaborate with crop modelers and breeders to kind of bring all this information together and get the phenotypic data in a format such that it's valuable and useful to them. One project we are working on now that I didn't have time to touch on was using a UAV for in-situ soil measurements. So we actually have a platform with a TDR kind of soil moisture probe. It has sharp prongs, and it can land and actually take 3 in-situ soil moisture measurements in the topsoil. And so we're kind of looking on hopefully using those data to calibrate and validate soil moisture estimates that we get from remote sensing. So using kind of thermal imagery and multispectral imagery for estimating soil moisture is kind of a widely used approach. And so we're hoping to automate that ground truth calibration process for the model using UAVs. So that's kind of one approach where we're taking the concept of physical interaction to actually do soil sensing with a drone. Yeah, thanks for the questions. Yeah.
In the Miscanthus project, did you guys do any previous analysis to determine what would be the most relevant predictor variables, in the fresh biomass function?
Yeah, so we did survey quite a bit of literature, and for Miscanthus, there's a little bit less out there than there are for like row crop models, whereas for like sorghum, we know that plant height and stem width are like two really important predictors of biomass and yield. So Miscanthus, we were a little more in the dark, I guess you could say, in talking with our kind of collaborators and looking at the literature, but we didn't do any specific analysis like ourselves. Yeah, so we're in the process now of looking at what's most important. It's looking like plant height, but there is some added value from some of those vegetation indices. Yep. Great.
With that, let's thank people over time.
Thank you.